All right. So thanks again, Joyce, for that introduction. And I'd like my panelists to check their mics, make sure they're on.
Testing.
All right.
Yes.
And one for Karen. All right. And if each of you could just introduce yourself very briefly, give maybe 1 or 2 sentences about who you are and what you do.
My name is Dan Riedel. I'm the CEO of a company called New Context. New Context looks at helping enterprises and critical infrastructure solve next-generation cybersecurity challenges. We've been working on research projects here in the state of California on how we can actually use threat intelligence to build a better energy grid for everybody.
Hi, I'm Karen Evans. I'm the National Director for the U.S. Cyber Challenge, and I retired after working 28 years in the federal government in information technology, where my last position was 6 years in the Bush administration managing the information technology and the budget for the Bush administration.
Hi, my name is Brian Wolfe. I'm Executive Vice President for Edison Electric Institute. We represent 75% of the electricity sector. So in this context of this panel, we're talking about the protection of critical infrastructure.
Great. Thank you all very much. So I'd like to start off our talk here by mentioning what happened last week in cybersecurity. If you're not aware, the credit reporting agency Equifax revealed that they had a massive breach which may affect 145 million Americans. And I think that's a very interesting, it's certainly unfortunate, but it's a very interesting problem because we now live in a world where this could have been an incident conducted by a foreign government. This could have been an act of cyber warfare. Certainly we've seen things like this done before. The Sony hack in 2014 against Sony Pictures was done by the North Koreans. And so I'd like our panelists to start off and discuss what it is that the Equifax that we can learn from the Equifax hack so far, and what it means for the future of international and geopolitical cyber relations. Brian looks like he wants to start.
I'm going to go first, since I woke up this morning and I had been notified by Equifax this morning that I was not one of the people that may have been affected, that I was one of the people that was affected by the Equifax breach. I think it's a new level of a data breach simply because Equifax is in the business of data protection and selling products to protect your credit. So I think this is clearly a very different level of information breach, and I think that's something that we should be concerned about as a country. But I think that, to our conversation, Seth, I think it really does probably pierce through a lot of what we would say is the confidence that we have in organizations and companies like this to be able to protect data. I think that compromising that trust, further erodes, how we interact with our government, how we're interacting in society. So I think this for a company that is in that business is very worrisome for us.
Karen, I'm glad you grabbed your mic. I was just going to ask you. Can you talk a little bit about what the government response here has been historically when we are dealing with these kinds of breaches, and what kinds of changes you think that can be made to make the U.S. safer?
So you asked, what have we learned so far? So publicly, we haven't really learned much of anything other than there was a breach. Sure. Okay, so behind the scenes, I'm sure a lot of this is being discussed as to the intent, which is what doesn't mean, because you're talking a lot, Brian, around personally, the personal effect it has about our citizens. That's one aspect of it, but the other aspect is the intent. Why, who, the attribution aspect of this, of who actually did it, and then why did they do it? If it was done by criminal intent in order to put more identities out on the dark web and do, taking people's personal finances and identity theft and things like that, that's one set of responses. But if it was done by a nation state for an intelligence, counterintelligence perspective, that's the question that you're leading into. Is this an act of war? And I think that's the discussion that the country will have at higher levels about the attribution associated around the intent of this breach.
Sure. Daniel, can you talk a little bit about the blurring of the line there between what is being done by a nation state as an act of war versus hackers trying to get data and sell it on the dark web?
All right. Let me be careful here. I think you always have to be careful when you're talking about nation states and attribution, which is why it's such a sensitive but also important topic. I think in any of these things, we have a environment that works a lot through anonymity, and because of that, whether it is a hacker, whether it is a hacker sponsored by a nation state, whether it's an actual nation state itself, I think at the end of the day, it's how do we actually get to the answer? You said it, attribution. Constantly right now, we have a situation with enterprises, and Equifax is no different, where the value of their assets is, let's just say, exceedingly high, especially if you look at personal Social Security numbers and what got taken in Equifax. And you're looking at what does an enterprise today have to protect itself? Versus if we're talking nation state, if a nation state's attacking an enterprise, there's no contest. Right? There's no contest. An enterprise is not going to be able to financially be able to fight that war. And so we have to think about what do we need to do to change what's currently broken, which is the fact that the tools that we're using today are not working. And so I think it comes right back down to attribution. You're going to hear me say that word a lot. Until we're able to identify attackers very quickly and identify where they're coming from, the cost to attack is going to be very little, and that's going to be exceedingly dangerous.
Yeah. What are some of the tools that are broken that perhaps can be fixed most quickly?
I think that we need to take a strong look at identity, and I think we need to take a look at our critical infrastructure and the networks that operate on them, and we have to be very careful in this day where we want to digitize everything, understanding what it is we're actually digitizing and what's the outcome of that. I know there's a big push on the, I love IoT, I love digital, my house is full of blinky things that you can control through the internet, but we have to be very careful when we look at our energy grid, we look at our water supply, what do we put online and how do we protect that and how do we protect those things, and we have to think years in advance.
Brian, that's your area of expertise.
Yeah, I'll just say I absolutely agree with that. I think that we're adding about 2,000 different devices to the energy grid every day. And Karen and I were talking about particularly a lot of the standards that have been put in place that really need to be, if I would say, reformed or overhauled in a way that actually makes sense for people to adhere to them. That's what we're up against right now. I think we want technology to be able to flow over the grid to the masses, but we also need to make sure that there's not a situation in particular like on critical infrastructure like Ukraine, for example. When we're talking about the foundation of our economy, and all of the other sectors rely on electricity. So if a part of that goes down, that's a chaos in our society that needs to be avoided. But clearly the technology advances and the technology on the grid, we need to really have standards in place that make sense and that are effective.
Karen?
Well, I'm going to talk a lot about attribution and intent and risk management as well as we go along through this. But I really think that we really have to take, as a society, ask some questions about how much innovation do we want to have, right? Because we want to use technology to the fullest promise that it offers. But when we do that, there is an unintended consequence associated with that. And how much information do you put out? And how are we going to use this? And how much privacy are we willing to give up as we're taking on this? And that's all related to risk. And it's fine if you're informed as you're going along and connecting up your house and doing all this great stuff with NIST and, you know, all of these things. They're great as long as you're an informed consumer as you're rolling it out. Because the minute that you hook up all of these, there are these unintended consequences that once you're networked and the network then gets breached, you are then subject to what's happening. And the other thing that I think that we need to discuss, which we don't as a nation, is the idea of a national ID card. The reason why the Equifax type of thing worked is you're not supposed to use a social security number as a national identifier, yet we use a social security number as a national identifier. So, you know, you either better have good standards so that individuals can be crosswalked, or we're going to have the hard discussion about a national ID card. That's his point about the national identity on the networks.
You can't protect a 9-digit number.
Say that again.
You can't protect a 9-digit number. It doesn't work. I think we also, so when you talked about building the technology, listen, we're going to connect all the things. I think trying to stop that train is not going to be very, it's not going to work. And so we have to look at how we build that technology. And just as we've been building our critical infrastructure for a long time, you know, bridges and power grids aren't just thrown up. They're carefully designed and carefully built. And so the technology that we put in there, and San Francisco is a world of startups, but we have to think very carefully how we build this. Attribution in who programs it, you know, keeping an identity on that person as they program it. Credentials need to be rethought out because they can be stolen. So how do you deal with that? So do you do some sort of continuous authentication and biometrics as you do that? Who's operating it? How do you manage and operating it? And I think we can agree in the world of a nuclear power plant, we need to know who's actually operating that. Who wrote the code? How is it being deployed? How are you managing that? And we do some of this today, but we need to be very detailed about it. So when something does happen, we can actually get to the attribution very quickly, as opposed to do a lot of forensic work and guesswork to who may have done something. It's the may have that is dangerous.
One thing, before I let you all continue, I want to be sure that we focus on is the technology industry at large, beyond security and privacy, has historically been very reluctant to engage with government and to allow itself to be even subjected to government regulations, and we can see that even today with a lot of the trouble that Uber has raised for itself. But we also seem to be at a point, especially in you know at hacker conferences like DEF CON and Black Hat, where we're seeing a request from both the cybersecurity community and the government community for more interaction between the two groups. Are there areas of low-hanging fruit where we can get those two groups to interact more and better to wind up protecting people in this room and our friends and families?
Well, you know, we've had now, I think, going on probably about 5 years, we've had a partnership with the federal government with many agencies, you know, primarily through an organized platform to have a partnership with the federal government for the purpose of the very first step, clearly, in information sharing. You know, you really can't arm yourself if you really don't know what you're protecting yourself against. You know, the threat scenario projects that we do and planning that we do, and Dan, we talked about that, you're in that business, is so critical to where we are as critical infrastructure. So I think that we're a little bit further along in the organization and the partnership in that way. You know, I think that where we're headed to next is the approach of tools and standards, and we're even focused in our industry, just because we're the foundation of the economy, we're actually planning now what's called cyber mutual assistance. So when there is a huge cyber event, we have the assistance we need from all the partners in order to address that as quickly as possible. So we go through different scenarios, different planning exercises, you know, some have, Karen knows this, but some have actually taken us off the grid, for example, for quite an extended period of time. And going through those types of scenarios on what would happen is really important for us to plan for. But I think that is a critical component, which is that partnership.
Brian, you mentioned tools and standards. And I want to address Karen this question. Do we need national standards for protecting data?
Okay, so first, before I answer that question, let us go back to the partnership, the thing that when you talk about like DEF CON and Black Hat
Sure.
and the government and those types of things. So I think the dynamic has to change before I answer the question about the standards. And I think you're seeing the dynamic change. So one of the things that the federal government has really learned a lot from Silicon Valley, for example, is bug bounty programs, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so, you know, hack the Pentagon, hack the Air Force, those types of things. What is happening is as the group, U.S. digital service guys have come into the federal government, it's really changing the culture. So what you're really talking about is how do you change the culture here? Because you don't want to stifle the innovation that's happening. So products get deployed, things are going to happen, that horse has left the barn. What you want to do is then have a mechanism that allows for the partnership. Part of the challenges that happens is very traditional enterprises look at, hey, if you've penetrated or it's an unauthorized access to my network under the Computer Fraud Act, I'm going to prosecute you, okay? And traditionally what would happen is if somebody notified it, they call the FBI, things get escalated, and then law enforcement shows up at your door. When in fact, it's people who really want to make a difference, who have found issues with code, who have found things that are trying to really then reach out and fix things and make it better. So what has happened in DoD is a change in policy to categorize that as researchers, okay? Mm-hmm. So that they can get the research, the information comes in, but what is critical is when they run, hack the Pentagon, is that there's a remediation team standing right by there that automatically then fixes things. So you're talking about changing the whole way the process works, and you're seeing it now incrementally happen by integrating some of the things that happen out here, like what companies have been traditionally doing, and then changing the process and the law to accommodate that researcher that allows for that information to come in. Standards, to me, if we do a standard, that's going to take a longer time for people to agree. And traditionally, tech companies really don't like a lot of regulations and a lot of standards because their argument is it stifles innovation. Sure. So you can have these arguments back and forth. I know you're going to jump in, so go ahead.
All right. Couldn't help myself.
I know,
so let's talk about standards for a second. I don't think they stifle innovation. Without the HTML standard, we wouldn't have what we have today. Without, some of the things, the internet standards that we have, we wouldn't have what we have today. And the good news is that when you talk about what Karen was just talking about, which is having research being able to identify and do remediation, well, we actually have been working on standards for the last several years on how we actually share that data. And so what we also need to be able to do is get that information to enterprises and to organizations to be able to protect themselves as fast as possible. And sometimes that means minutes, which means machine level ability to be able to read and process that information. And I'm on a standard, several, one of which is called STIX, and that's exactly what we're doing. We're trying to build a threat intel standard that is easily able to share that information as rapidly possible. And then we have another standard called OpenC2, which is how do we remediate that. So we absolutely need exactly what we just talked about, but we need to get that information to enterprises as fast as we possibly can, and then they need to be able to use it to protect our critical infrastructure.
Okay, but correct me if I'm wrong as the moderator. The question was, do you want a standard developed? Is it a top-down standard? Is it ground-up standard? If we started really looking at some of the ones like HTML that have been used, those are ground-up standards that take longer to get implemented, right?
Sure.
Right, and that's through common use. So when you ask, should we have a national standard, it depends on if it's a ground-up standard type of thing that he's talking about that has wider adoption and then people actually agree? Or is it top down? Or is it something in between, which then the regulators get into? And that's where everybody starts arguing. And so with Equifax, what I think you're going to find out, because you start reading these stories about their security was woefully, terrible, understated, all this other stuff, is how much do they have to do and what is the standard, quote unquote, for due diligence? And how do they demonstrate that they've actually done due diligence with all these class action suits that are going to come against them, which gets into this?
Well, one of the interesting examples that we have here is the Internet of Things. And NIST recently updated its, I think it was January 2016 when they updated their standards for post-market guidance for IoT devices, including medical devices, which, if you remember, the St. Jude's pacemaker was recalled a few weeks ago. And that was guidance. None of these companies must adhere to this, but it's very quickly become a thing that's been adopted because the companies see the benefit to consumers, to themselves, to their shareholders, in adhering to some kind of standard. And I sort of worry that at this point we're debating about which chair should be at the front of the bow on the Titanic. Meanwhile, the ship's going down, and without the government or some other agency getting involved and saying, here's what the standard should be, or here's what our recommended guidance is. But I want to hear from you guys. I mean, is that a crazy idea? Is that something that we should be working towards?
Well, that's why I said in the beginning that we have to have some reform of the current standards that are even out there, because to Karen's point, I think that they have been, when you look at the pace of technology, the NIST standards are not keeping up with the pace of the technological changes that we're seeing. So if you just keep that in mind, if you're not going back and you're also not making it easier for a small business versus a large enterprise versus a government entity versus to adhere to those standards, you're also not going to have something that's commonly adopted by everyone. And so I think when we talk about technology in general, we're going to have to make sure that, we're wanting everything right now to be connected and everything to be able to communicate with each other. That's changed because, probably just 5 years ago, I think we're on our, 8 different iteration of NIST standards. And I think that, the pace of that is changing dramatically as quickly, well, the NIST standards are not, but the pace of technology. The pace of the NIST standards need to change just as quickly as the next iteration of an Apple iPhone. We're not doing that, though, because it's really a government process, and it needs to be more nimble. So, I mean, how many times have you heard that?
Well, and I'm going to go back to this risk-based approach, okay? And this is part of the discussion that has to happen. So even if you have standards and all the standards get implemented, or you're going along the lines what everybody's arguing back and forth, there comes a point where you have to do trade-offs. Companies have to do trade-offs. And so this is the risk-based approach that has to go forward. So I'm going to pick on Yahoo right now, okay? And so one of the things, you saw all the security guys when they announced the breaches saying, well, they never listened to us, they didn't listen to us, we gave them all this stuff. But if you step back and really look at what that company was looking at the time, is there's analysis that has to happen at a business level. Do I make my services so secure that a breach doesn't happen and now I don't have any users? Or do I invest in making my product more palatable so that I have more users so that I can sell the company? And that's a risk trade-off that has to happen when you do, but you have to have an informed decision. So you have these standards that are developed, but people have to understand how to use the standards in order to do this risk-based framework going forward. And I would say we are woefully behind in understanding how to do some of the things that you're talking about with sticks. And, do I invest in that to do the threat and really understand what I'm playing in the threat landscape? Because you have to understand what threats are coming at you for the business that you're in, the information that you have, in order to be able to do the investments against any kind of standards that are there.
Sure. waiting for you to
Just
talk.
waiting for permission.
Yep. No,
Not,
go ahead.
not that I need it.
No.
I think that it's, so I want, Karen, you said something backstage about education. I think that's huge. I think that you're looking at, we go back to identity. As long as there's a username and password, they'll be phishing. And even as we educate people in phishing, the phishers will get smarter. And so we have to look at how we handle credentials, because that's broken. We need to teach our engineers that they need to care about the data that they're creating. We do need to figure out a faster way of handling attribution. And I'm going to add one other thing in here, just for fun. I think insurance companies can also potentially help out quite a bit as well. So at the end of the day, if these companies can't get insured because they're not showing that they have the ability to protect their data, then perhaps that can actually move some budgets to make that happen. But I think that in general, it goes back to, and I'm going to go back, Seth, to your original point here. You asked, are we fighting nation states? And again, I said earlier that an enterprise has a really hard time fighting the budget of a nation state. It's just going to lose. In which case, do we have to ask ourselves, what do we do here? Is the government come in and step in and start protecting us? Do we define this as, like, I don't like the three-letter word up there because it's a very scary word, right? Yeah. And but we do need to take it very seriously. And we need to have some hard conversations because we are losing it.
Sure. I mean, the idea of cyber war has a lot of many moving parts to it. And I think something that people expected after Stuxnet in 2010, for those who don't remember the virus that was used to disable centrifuges in Iran, people are expecting more of that, and instead what we've seen are attempts at destabilization, at creating chaos. We saw that last year with our own elections. It's not so much about can you destroy things, it's can you decrease trust in institutions, and judging by everyone nodding their head, we seem to be onto something. Are there any pieces of low-hanging fruit that we can grab and make sure that things get done easily and quickly? Are there tools or techniques that are sort of obvious that we're not doing?
Well, I'll say I won't say that because it sounds too political, but I don't think you really go out, for instance, if you're in our industry, and Daniel, you have an interest in our industry, but it's you don't go out in our industry and say this is exactly what we're doing to be able to protect our critical infrastructure. It's just a part of what we're doing. We're going through everything. If you had told me that, wow, we represent electric companies, which are critical infrastructure, and if you had told me probably even 7-8 years ago that we now employ white coat hackers to be able to actually test how secure our infrastructure is, I would have said that doesn't sound at all like a staid monopoly behavior, of what we're doing. But I do think because of the partnership with DHS and agencies and understanding better the threats and having high-level security clearances to be able to, I mean, we've been to NORAD in Colorado, we've watched this firsthand. Some of it is, it's very overwhelming, very scary to witness, but it's also, in real time. And I think that for critical infrastructure in particular, and I think, Karen, you made this point, you've got to be able to look at the investment you're making in this, because you could throw so much money at constantly trying to prepare yourself and protect yourself. And again, the threat's constantly changing, so you would be making a different investment every time you turn around in order to protect against a different level of threat or different type of threat.
So when you ask what we could be doing today, I'm going to be controversial, okay? That's what I'm known for. To me, this is really, that's why I'm doing the U.S. Cyber Challenge, and it's people are going to solve the problem, okay? Because my big saying is a fool with a tool is still a fool, okay? So we it's how people use the technology, and we have to have people at all different skill sets and all walks of life that have to be able to know what they're doing, develop, write code if they're going to become application developers, engineers. I mean, so and I wrote a lot on this as well with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. There's different stuff, like we have business acumen. If you get a master's in business, you have to have business acumen. This is now the same thing, because there isn't any walk of life that you are not using technology in one aspect or another. So I call it cyber acumen, because you have to know the risk associated, whether I'm a parent, okay, whether I'm a teacher, whether I'm the CEO of the company. There is a certain amount of acumen that you have to have because you're using technology. And that is going to happen through the education system. And so the way that we are doing things in education has to change, but that's a midterm, long-term type of issue. Right. Which is one of the reasons why we started up the U.S. Cyber Challenge, because the idea that you could use competitions that could test against standards, that could test against new developments, that could test against different types of tools that are being used, because once you put them in people's hands, tools are used in ways that you have never thought about doing, okay? Applications are used in ways that you never intended as a developer, and that's what the competitions are about, so that you can bring all that innovation in so that people can then become aware, and then you can start defending against it.
Sorry. I think that you're absolutely right on education. I wanted to make a couple of points. I'm not going to be able to make all of them. I think that, in our company, we have a process called lean security that we're trying to teach our engineers and teach the people that we work with. I think that one of the main principles of that is awareness. It's a principle that we have. Be aware of your environment. As a consumer, be aware of your environment. There is nothing short-term that we can do, except having enterprises follow best practices, having enterprise use the known tools that they have today. But the challenge is that the defender has to be right 100% of the time. The attacker only has to be right once. The other challenge with that is the attacker is going to, like these people who are deploying technology to protect their environment today, well, their attackers attacking what is unknown tomorrow. And so that's not a great situation to be in. So short-term, education, fantastic. Short-term, fund your organization to protect the data that you have. Be aware of the data that you have. We talk about, you ask about earlier, should we have standards around protecting data? We have tons now. We've got PCI, we've got HIPAA, we've got SOC 2 audits. We've got more ways of understanding our data, but that's not helping us. And so we have to think about long-term solutions. I think automation is key for enterprises to lower the cost to their environments. And I think that we have to start maybe having this conversation on who are doing these attacks, and since they're not getting punished for them, they're going to continue to do them until they are. So we've got to figure out how to handle that as well.
Yeah. Hacking back is a fun topic that we could probably spend an entire day talking about. But do we even need a national security breach disclosure law? We don't even have that. We have 47 different laws, some of which are very similar. 3 states don't even care, which is fewer than the ones that don't care about voting. 5 states don't care about their voting standards, about their voting machine standards. So, I mean, if we can't even agree on disclosure, on breach disclosures, where are we as a country? No, well, I was hoping a little bit more interaction for that.
Look, I had the opportunity, as I love to say this, to manage when VA lost its laptop, okay? That was 26 million pieces of information, and that was the first time that happened. So that's where, and we had a task force, and all that information is still out there, and we advocated for a national breach law at that point. Fast forward, in the CSIS report again, we advocated that just for businesses to have a national breach law would make it a lot easier than having to negotiate, 45 different ones as you're doing business in each of those states, because there are varying requirements. And so that adds cost on to companies as well. So, but then what happens when they do it? It's becoming such commonplace now that people are becoming, immune to it. Mm-hmm. And so, really what you're going to do about that? What do you end up doing about that? Because, for example, like when I get a new Bank of America credit card in the mail, I said, oh, they must have had another breach, and they changed my account, right? And so, like, you're becoming immune to some of these, what is happening, and we as a nation need to kind of step forward and say, what does it really mean, and what is the impact? So I'm back to, what is really the intent of taking this information, and that's what you were talking about, Daniel, is who do you hold accountable when this happens? And when you hold them accountable, I mean, and this is an example that I use all the time. If a company is really bad, it's similar to when you go away and you start posting all your vacation pictures on Facebook and social media, and you say, I'm away, and and nobody is at my house, so come and rob my house. In essence, that's what you're saying, right? And so, and then your house gets robbed. And then on top of it, you didn't set your alarm system before you left. The way that some people are looking at this situation is saying that homeowner should be prosecuted. Okay, they may have stupidity associated with that, right? And the insurance claim, you still have to report it to the police department in order to make an insurance claim.
Sure.
Well, should they go to jail because they didn't turn on their insurance? They didn't turn on their alarm system and they posted stuff on social media? No, a crime still happened. And so we need to figure that out. To your point about hacking back, it gets even worse. So in the cyber world, the discussion is, okay, now I know who actually stole my stuff. So I want to go down the street and I want to steal it back. So now I'm going to commit another crime on top of another crime in order to get my stuff back. Now, is that right? That's not right. So that's why we have to have this discussion about how are you going to hold people accountable? Who are you actually going to hold accountable? And it gets back to attribution. How do you know it was really them who did it based on all the technology that we have to anonymize who we are?
Sure.
Okay, sorry. I'm off my soapbox.
Well, I'm going to just say one thing because we need that. I do think there has to be some level of tool and some level of accountability out there. But I do like what you said with regards to insurance, because I think there is at the heart of it, whether you're a small business or you're a major enterprise, I do think that there is, just like you fill out forms for your life insurance or your health insurance or whatever that is, you're mitigating risk in some way or form, and they have to be able to determine if you've done that properly. So now you still have to have the proper education in the insurance companies to be able to do that, but I do think that that could be one effective tool for government, small businesses to be able to do that, which in effect, protects the consumer.
I think that I actually wrote positive down here because we've been really negative up here, and it's kind of a bummer. So there's a lot of really smart people working on this problem right now, and I think that we're trying to figure out how we come together to solve it. We can't solve it as 47 and 3 or a fraction of anything. We've got to solve it all together, and so that is going to take, I think, some action from government in Washington to figure out how we do that. I think the states need to come together. If our infrastructure is actually under attack, we do need to declare that it's actually under attack. There's some benefits to that, which means that there's a lot of budget that gets freed up to be able to solve those problems. We don't consider that we're under attack right now in that state, so we don't have that budget to operate. And we're going to have to see what happens, as the next breaches happen. So far, most of the breaches have been around financial information, and I hope that and I don't want that to continue. Let me rephrase that. But, there's a lot of other things that are out there that I know that people are watching. You saw what happened to Ukraine, so we do know that physical attacks can happen. I think we need to be aware. We need to be vigilant. And Karen, what you said earlier, I think holds stands. As individual citizens, we need to realize that somebody who steals our credential can then use those credentials to attack somebody else. And so we also have some level of personal responsibility to try and actually keep ourselves safe, so that actually that helps other folks. But in general, I do feel that we are trying to, there's a lot of really smart people trying to solve this problem. I think that it's not going to get solved anytime in the near future, but I think we do need to come together to solve it.
So we've only got a few minutes left. In figuring out what it's going to take to solve it, what do we do in the meantime?
Follow best practices. You may not like NIST, but at least it's a framework. It's there. It's better than nothing. As a consumer, be an advocate that your customer, the companies you do business with, are protecting your data. If you work for an enterprise, then be aware of the data that you're handling. Even no matter what role you have in that organization, be aware. It doesn't have to just be an engineer. You can be a head of marketing. You still have to be aware. So it's a reality. We need to be aware. We enjoy. Hey, Amazon is great. I can order. I can order anything within 8 hours and it's there. But along these benefits also means some responsibility. They also need to realize that that's education. It just comes down to education. That's the best defense right now.
Is it? I mean, so we were discussing before the panel how when it comes to this Equifax breach, we still don't know, for one thing, that there are people like Brian who are getting notified that they've been affected, but the vast majority have no idea if they're actually affected or not. And the best practice as to what to do to deal with the situation once you find out you have been affected is not clear. As Brian pointed out, the so-called best solution, which is to notify the 4 major credit agencies and have them freeze your credit, doesn't really work for people who need to do things with their credit on a more regular basis. It's costly. It requires physical letters.
So I'm going to echo what Daniel has said here too as well, is it's still education. Because what you're talking about here is that you can't make this assumption that everything is rosy and people are taking care of stuff for you. What you have to do is really be diligent as a consumer, in this particular area as a consumer, you really have to take a look at it. Whether you agree or not, you can get a free credit report from each of the credit groups, one a year. And if you do it right, you can pull it out and cover the whole year, and you can look to see who is checking on your credit. And actually Equifax suspended the change. There's a bunch of different things that you can do as an educated consumer to protect your own identity. And that really is, to your point, what you have to do as you go forward. I think it's great, all the innovation that we have, but we shouldn't blindly be using it. And so, I think it's great the way that Google does stuff with it, artificial intelligence. We've been talking about all these other things that are out there, but what it really comes down to is there's personal responsibility, there is an enterprise responsibility, there's a national responsibility as we go forward, and those are the things that are being discussed right now. And, what are the proper roles, like in critical infrastructure, and how do you have to do that? And because it's evolving so fast, maybe the discussions aren't happening as fast as a lot of people would like to have them, but I would say that there are a lot of discussions. Maybe the answers aren't necessarily the way that a lot of people would like to have them. But what is good about our country is that we do discuss them without edicts saying that this is how certain things are going to happen. That's the purpose of NIST. So if you don't like those standards, then participate in the process to make the standards better. Participate in what you're doing with STIX. Participate in the information sharing and push on the areas that if you don't agree that it's working, then push on it so that you can engage and make it better.
All right. We are out of time. Any last words, Brian?
I'm good.
No? All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming in and listening to Brian and Daniel and Karen debate cybersecurity and why that's going to be the big issue of the near future.